So I get asked a lot of different questions that are really in depth and need specific answers, and it's really hard to do that over chat. So for my coaching members, I winded up doing live calls. Recently, we've added some live calls called Coffee and Donuts with Frank. I don't even drink coffee or eat donuts, but that's the name that we lovingly came up with. And I'm doing that every week now with them. In addition, I'm also answering some of the big questions that I see that you ask all the time. Here's us going through all that. Let's discuss. Hey, before we get started, we have those gifts in the description for you. First one being the Getting Started workshop. It's going to walk you through every phase of the hiring process. Plus, there's some hidden bonuses in there to include the candidate eligibility exam to see where you fall as a police candidate and if you're going to run into any hurdles. Next is the free coaching call with myself or any of the other instructors. Jump on a free coaching call. We'd be glad to help you through any of the hiring process that you need help with and help you become the cop or the law enforcement officer that you've been trying to become. Now, let's jump in. Welcome, welcome. All right, we will be going through some questions that were pre-submitted today, and we will be starting the new Coffee and Donuts here with me, which is ironic because I don't drink coffee or eat donuts. But the way it's going to work is much like our other live calls. If you have a question, feel free to ask. Either raise your hand or put it in the chat. I have some pre-submitted questions that I'm going to get to first, and then I will open it up to public Q&A. So whoever wants to jump on, as they jump on, feel free. You can jump in and out as you need to. This session will last for the time as questions are being asked, all the way up to the 30-minute mark. So first question I have that was submitted to me that as soon as I open it up again, give me 1 second. Here we go. How different is the Police and Fire Commission versus the Oral Board? So understand that the Police and Fire Commission is just a civilian panel board. So it's out of a specific state, and the way that this works, and I'm not going to cover the police and fire specifically, I'm going to cover all civilian panel boards compared to a traditional oral board from the department. So what a traditional oral board is you have your, you have maybe a senior ranking member, maybe it's a lieutenant, maybe it's the sheriff, maybe it's a captain or hiring official. Then you have a couple other mid-levels, which it could be a couple sergeants, hiring sergeants, depending on how big the department is. And then maybe one officer, and that's part of the recruitment team, such as a field training officer or something along those lines. The way that this works is the oral board, you're going to go in, it's traditional. They're going to ask you some questions about yourself. They're going to possibly ask you what you know about the department. They may ask you what's your interest in that department or law enforcement in general. And they're going to maybe run you through some scenarios. So the big thing is, one, learning to articulate yourself and your answers and learning that department. Those are usually the big thing. And those are law enforcement officers typically asking the question. Every now and then you might have an HR representative who sits on that oral board that might actually ask questions. Usually they just sit on it and they don't ask questions. Now, a civilian panel board is completely different. They're comprised of the municipality or of the county or however they do it. And what it is it may have 1 or 2 officers that sit on the board. However, most of them are civilian members of the community. That could be maybe the mayor, that could be the county commissioner. It could be the aldermans or any type of member, city council members, anything along those lines. And the problem you run into with them, and it's a good thing and a bad thing as long as it's balanced properly. The problem you run into with them is they are not law enforcement officers, right? So they're going to ask you questions that might completely be off the wall. How do you handle a situation where a officer is beating a civilian and causing them significant serious bodily harm? Well, they might want an answer such as, oh, well, I'm going to stop that officer, except in your training, you'll learn as you become a law enforcement officer, it's not that black and white, right? What if that officer is just using the wrong tool, right? What if that suspect actually has a gun and that officer is using a baton to try to mitigate the use of deadly force? then you run up and you stop the officer, and then that suspect grabs the gun. But that's the problem you run into with these individuals. Now, usually when you sit on some type of committee such as this, you have some type of training, or there's at least some officers on there to explain the situation. But ultimately, they're all evaluating you. So with that evaluation, it then comes down to is the civilian panel board members going to give you a favorable recommendation? Are they going to approve it? Sometimes it's based on vote, right? So all the committee members, let's say there's 7, right, which you need 4 to be selected, right, or to pass that. If it's a majority vote. Other times it's graded much like an oral board, where they each individual scores your answers. They compile those scores, and then the top candidates move on. It's a tough one. Civilian panel boards are usually a toss-up, right? You have to understand you're balancing the response of a law enforcement response without any law enforcement training, as well as a political response to meet the needs of said, panel. So that's one thing to consider there. It is what it is. And unfortunately, if your department you're applying to has that, you're going to have to go through it. There's no way around it. But the tip I will give you is make sure that when you go into it, you're going into it as a unbiased, and make your answers as unbiased as possible. And when I say unbiased, I'm not talking about, age or sex or religion or race or anything like that. I'm talking about police versus civilians. Try to be as unbiased as possible, and don't lean too heavily into law enforcement is always right, and don't lean too heavily into, the community members or the suspects are always right. So just kind of keep that in mind. Next one. Does bankruptcy disqualify people from police agencies? Yes and no. So for this one, having a recent bankruptcy will have an effect on you. Most of the time, what you'll see is a department, for our coaching, one of our criteria is that we're open about is no bankruptcies within the last 5 years, right? That's where we draw the line. That's where a lot of departments draw the line. Some departments will say 7 years. Some departments will say 10 years. It just depends. And if they have that criteria, they can, and it's not a state criteria, right, where they're required to follow it. It's their own personal criteria. They could waive it, but it's less than 1% chance that they would ever do that. They would just say, no, hey, you're not eligible. Please reapply after, so much time has passed. So yes, a bankruptcy shows financial irresponsibility. That might not be the case. It might have just been a hard time, but that's what they lean towards. And unfortunately, if you have a recent bankruptcy within the last few years, I'm not going to say it's going to completely exclude you, but it's going to definitely make for a very large hurdle for you to try and get through. Okay. What if a case was a DA reject, which means the district attorney decided not to move forward with the case, right? For insufficient evidence, very common reason, right? The DA doesn't believe that they could win. That doesn't stop a law enforcement officer from arresting you, right? So doesn't mean that you're even guilty. It just means that you have an arrest for said charge, but the DA said no. And the report was a lie. How can I tell the truth if the truth will be based off of a false report? If you ask any of my coaching members, any coaching member, whether they're an alumni or anyone in the community now, you'll hear me say all the time, 1, you can't account for human error. And 2, you can only articulate the facts, right? So saying, hey, the whole thing was a lie, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Maybe that's just your perspective, and your perspective will not be considered in the hiring process. They might ask you to elaborate more on it, and you can. But if it comes to just getting past this hurdle, so you were arrested, the case was immediately dismissed by the DA for lack of evidence, and the officer stated something, but then in the arrest, to try to get probable cause, because that's what you need for an arrest. And during that, the officer said, XYZ happened, but that never took place, or maybe body cam footage shows something completely different happened. And the DA, the district attorney, says, no, we're not prosecuting this. Well, yes, you were you were arrested for this crime, but you were never formally charged with it, right? If it's an immediate rejection, then you were never formally charged. A law enforcement officer cannot charge you with a crime. That is a judicial proceeding, right? In the court system. A law enforcement officer can arrest you for a crime based on probable cause, but in order to be charged, there has to be, probable cause and evidence that you are the one who committed said crime and said crime actually occurred, right? And you met the criminal elements of that. So for this one specifically, you would just articulate as such, right? You would just say, hey, yes, I was arrested for ABC. However, the charges were immediately dropped and rejected, dismissed, whatever you want to use, whatever term they used, due to the fact that there was no evidence. And then I would give a caveat of your perspective real quick, where I say, yeah, it was an incident where it was a misunderstanding and I tried to explain it. However, the officer just moved forward with the arrest. Ultimately, as I said, the charges were dismissed. That's it. And that's how I would leave it. And I would not try to go into detail. And I definitely wouldn't say the officer was lying and everything. You're applying to now, do officers lie? Yes, there's bad officers out there. But do you really want to sit here and say, hey, I'm looking to get into law enforcement and all my encounters with law enforcement are negative because I think all cops lie? It's probably not the best way to go about presenting your future career to your future employer, your feelings towards the profession. Okay, so I'm almost done with my background process. The CVSA had me so nervous, but he hasn't said anything about it. It was a third-party background investigator. He asked for more information from me and asked that I reach out to people who haven't replied. If I failed, he wouldn't be asking me all of these questions, correct? He would just DQ me. So ultimately, this question is, I've done a CVSA. I haven't heard whether or not I've passed, but my background investigator, who's a third party, is still asking me questions. Yeah, we call that a success indicator, right? So there's very few times where you actually get a, hey, you passed and you're moving forward, right? It's more, hey, you're just moving forward. So if you've completed your polygraph or your CVSA, your voice stress analyzer, then you absolutely and are moving forward and they're still contacting references. If they're still contacting references, you're looking pretty good on that one. I would not spend too much time. I would not spend too much time beating yourself up or worrying about the past phase, because chances are if they're still moving forward like they are in this situation, you're doing all right. Okay. That being said, I'm going to wrap up some pre-submitted questions. I have some more, but I want to get to y'all's questions first. So hit me with it. You all can raise your hand or type it in the chat, whatever you want to do. And looks like we have some. There we go. And then we will go from there. So if I was to receive an offer from a department on a Friday and only work Monday through Thursday, does it still count as giving 2 weeks notice if my letter of resignation, I state my last date of employment will be 2 Fridays from the offer date, but my last working, yeah, you're overthinking this, right? So your last working day would be, as long as you give notice, right? And you try to, so 2 weeks is a fabricated and arbitrary number, right? That's something that actually businesses came up with because they thought that that was reasonable. If you ask a business now, because the hiring is so difficult, they'll say, hey, we want a month or 2 months notice, but you give that much notice and you can 100% guarantee they're going to be treating you differently with your place of employment, not as a malicious way. It's just psychological. Excuse me. So for this particular question, as long as you give notice, right? Now you might see on some PHSs, they say, hey, did you give proper notice? 2 weeks but once again, 2 weeks is not some legal standard. There's no legal standard to it. It's did you give proper notice? And proper notice could be a week. Proper notice could be 2 weeks. It could be a month, whatever's normal for your current position right now. But I would not worry about that too much. And once again, if you're hired, you're really not worried about you want to still be respectful and give notice, but you're really not worried about the other aspects. So I would consider that. All right. Follow up. If you can't file 2-week notice due to a time constraint, would this hurt as a lateral if a department looks at, I guess that's supposed to be the 2-week standard, and how to articulate if this was to happen. So this is simple, right? Hey, I received a conditional, or I received a final offer from my current department when I was working here. They said that start date was in a week in order to make academy date. I immediately let my supervisor know and gave them proper notice. And that's what I would just say. Oh, well, if it was 1 week, was it proper notice? Yes, that organization, the notice I gave was sufficient. And that's how I would articulate it, right? Don't paint yourself into the corner, because if you say, well, I gave proper notice, and they say, well, what was proper notice? And you say, oh, typically 2 weeks there. And you say, oh, so you didn't give proper notice. Well, no, and then you're going into this circle and this back and forth with your investigator. And once again, this is for a lateral. Laterals are way quicker, right? Especially if it's an in-state lateral or a lateral that accepts your out-of-state credentials. They already know that you've been approved as a law enforcement. So their biggest concern is not going to be checking your background past that. It's going to be checking your recent activity with your current department. Your background will actually just transfer over with them if it's within the same state or that state has a lateral program. All right, I have time for another question or two, depending on the question. Oh, we have another one here. Hang on. Oh, we have some questions. Okay. Board question. In what areas did you excel in your previous position? Would this mean the job I'm currently working? Absolutely. Or any previous position, right? If I was going to say, hey, both in the military and my previous law enforcement position, the areas I really excelled in were teamwork and following orders, right? I made sure that my supervisors knew that if they had a task for me and they gave me orders on it, it was getting done. I was going to be the one to get it done, and usually with very minimal supervision, unless it was something that I needed additional training or additional knowledge on. So, and notice what I did there. I combined two different positions. So you could do that. You could do you can do it if you're in a new position, right? You've been there a month or two. I don't know if I would use it. I would use the position that you were at, before that you were at for a year or for 3 years or whatever it was. That way it's solidified. Hey, yeah, I worked at this position for a year. One thing that I believe I really excelled in was, the paperwork, right? And try to correlate it to the position you're trying to get at now. So dealing with customers, communication, whatever. For tattoo policies and any kind of grooming appearance, I recommend looking at the department's general orders, policies, manuals, if they have it published on their website, as many do nowadays. That is true. Larger organizations, and that's usually because the state requires it or something, will have that stuff published. I say many, but it's still 51%. There's still quite a few departments out there that their policies and procedures are not public. And the reason why is because they don't want criminal elements understanding law enforcement procedures. So while policies may be on there, general orders kind of follow under procedures. So those might not be on there, but you should be able to find it. If you can't find it in the recruitment page, then yeah, get on their page and look at it. You can do a little bit of Googling yourself and try to find it there. But for the most part, that's the way I would go about it to make sure you can find out what you can. And then if all else fails, if you can't find anything through self-research, just pick up the phone and make a phone call, right? You could send an email on something like this, and it would be great to get that in writing. But if you're on a time crunch and you need to apply, I just recommend picking up the phone, calling their whatever recruitment number they have, or if they have a recruitment email, you can send that. But I would just try to reach out to them and say, hey, this is what I have going on. I have these tattoos. Is this a elimination for me, or will I still be considered for an employment? And go that route with it. All right. Okay. That's going to wrap up Coffee and Donuts today. remember, we're doing this every Monday and Wednesday. So every Monday and Wednesday, you all will have access to me to ask any of y'all's questions. I have pre-submitted questions that I will be answering at all times to make sure that you are getting as much out of this as possible. So if anything else comes up, I will hang tight till everyone logs off, or if there's any last minute questions, feel free to ask. We got about 3 minutes. But for the most part, I hope you all enjoy it. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Hey, before I let you go, I did want to ask real quick, if you enjoy this, know that we go in and we answer all the questions on YouTube. And then if you have any enjoyment from the podcast, from the audio podcast, no matter where you're watching it, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any of the other platforms, please leave us a review and like and share it. That's how we get out there, and then that shows me that this is the content that you all want to see, and then it's actually being beneficial. So if you have a comment and you want to ask a quick question, you can ask it over on YouTube. We try to answer all of them for as long as we can, as well as any of the extra gifts that we have for you. But additionally, you can go on to our website. It's Armagan CT, so ARMOGANCT.com. And up there we have live free trainings that we do as well occasionally. And you can keep checking there and see if that's something that you want to jump onto. I hope this all helps you. As I said before, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.